Welcome to the Story Geeks Show. On today's show, we got a busy show today. Up first, I'll be reacting to Ben Shapiro's review of The Batman, and then I'll be digging deeper into episode 4 of Moon Knight, and I'll finally go behind the scenes into the creation of chapter 1 of my full cast audiobook, co-written with Nathan SCHECK, Death of a Bounty Hunter. I played a clip from that audiobook on Tuesday. I will be breaking that down, going behind the scenes a little bit about how we created that in today's show at the very end. This show will have spoilers for both The Batman and Moon Knight episode 4, so just know that going in. I'm Jay Shear, co-writer of Death of a Bounty Hunter and Time Slingers, and this is the Story Geeks Show. So up first today, a very potentially controversial segment, because I thought that I had a take on The Batman. Now, most people love The Batman. They love it. They love it. I like it. But I do think it has one major issue that I'll get into a little bit more here. I've already created one video on the How Stories Work channel. I'll talk a little bit more about that today. But I also heard that, conservative pundit, for lack of a better term, conservative idealist, Ben Shapiro did not like it. And it made me wonder if we had some of the same issues, or if his issues were different than mine, or how that was going to play out. So do I agree with Ben Shapiro? Well, let's find out, shall we? I won't play his entire video today, by the way. So if you want to see his entire review, you can watch that on his channel. He has the rights to that content. I'm just going to show a few clips here and there, and then respond to some of the things that he brings up in his review. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Now, remember, I'm coming at this from a Batman fan, but also from the point of view of someone who writes stories. And so one of the things that I'm always looking for is what's set up in this story delivered upon? Does it make sense? Does it live into what I think that the creators were intending? So we're just going to play some clips from Ben Shapiro's review of The Batman, and then I'm going to be reacting to some of that. The first clip we have coming up here is a 40-second clip, and we'll take a look at it together right now. Let's go full screen here. Let's check it out.
All righty, folks. So last night I went and I saw The Batman. My review of that is coming up in just one moment. This video is sponsored by Ring. So last night I went and saw The Batman, went and saw it with my wife. It is 1 million hours long. And it's one of those movies where I started off and I was like, okay. And then I got a little further in and I was like, all right. And then I got to the end, I was like, meh. And then the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And so you're about to hear a lot of hot takes on The Batman, because I hate this movie.
So there you go. There's our first portion of what he's talking about here, where he says he hates this movie. And let's talk about some of the things that he likes, because he goes on to describe some of the things that he really likes about the movie. But there's only one thing that he really, really likes about this movie, and that is he likes the look and the tone of the film. He does sort of compliment the music and the performances. He says that are basically kind of just okay, except for he really did like the Riddler and the Penguin performances, so he liked those. So what's my response to those aspects of this? Well, I think that we do agree on the look and tone of the film. I think that that's fantastic. I had no issues there at all. In fact, I think that what Matt Reeves creates in the tone and the feel of Gotham is fantastic. There's a little bit of Nolan in there, primarily because he's shooting the same city. They're both shooting Chicago, although he includes some aspects of Liverpool, which gives it more of a Gothic feel at times, which is fantastic and I think is appropriate. So I actually prefer Matt Reeves's characterization of Gotham even over and above Nolan's characterization of Gotham. And it sort of feels like a mix between Nolan and what we got on the early days with Tim Burton. So I like that part of it a lot. I think we disagree. We disagree pretty strongly on the music. He kind of partially liked the music. I really liked the music. I thought the use of, it's kind of on trend to like the 1990s right now and see throwbacks to the 1990s. And one of the things that I think is done here in this film is that it feels like a lot of 1990s aesthetics, and I think the music adds really well to that. So I really like the music. I think Giacchino's actually a really good composer. Now, he did say that as far as performances go, I'm going to break down a couple of the performances. I think Pattinson's performance as Batman is is good. I think it's good. I think it's we're not asking him to do anything that's super outside the realm of what we know of this kind of Batman, right? This great detective, but very, his only emotion is anger for the most part. So we're not seeing like a lot of range here, and I think that that's okay. It's not necessarily my favorite kind of Batman, but I do think it sets up future movies using Robert Pattinson, who's a fantastic actor. We just watch something like The Lighthouse, and you can see how good of an actor he is. I think it's setting him up for better, more nuanced roles in this character for Batman in the future. Kravitz's Catwoman, Shapiro says it's okay. I've seen this film twice. I think Kravitz's performance as Catwoman is great. I actually think that she displays a lot more emotional range as she's asked to as a character in this story. She's asked to be sort of, you can look at this film through Catwoman's eyes as how most people feel about Gotham. And that has its own problems, advantages, and disadvantages. She's willing to do things that she probably should not be willing to do, but a lot of people in Gotham are. That's why Gotham is so corrupt. So I think that she does a really good job of like, I want good things to happen, but I'm willing to do bad things to make that happen. So I thought that was really good. I liked her performance a lot. One of my favorite performances, and I totally disagree with, this is a strong disagreement with Ben Shapiro here, is that Turturro's performance as Falcone, I think, is amazing. And this is the same guy who played the butler in Mr. Deeds. Sneaky, sneaky, sir. Like this guy. That's the same guy who's playing Falcone. And Falcone seems like he controls a lot of things in this film. So I have a strong disagree with Ben Shapiro there. I think Falcone, played by John Turturro, is amazing. Now, I think he liked Dano's performance as the Riddler, and I think he liked it a lot more than I did, because I think that this is, now, don't get me wrong, I think Paul Dano is doing a fantastic job with what he was asked to do for this character. For me, it felt a little bit too psychotic. I think it felt a little bit too over the top psychotic, and I would have like made it a little bit more subdued and made him seem like not a character who's so unhinged, but rather a character who's super intelligent. I mean, the guy's an accountant, right? And obviously he's lashing out against this corruption in the city, but I would have made that much more subdued and had his behavior be really targeted towards things that were corrupt and like revealing different aspects of what was going on. I think he gets a little bit unhinged at parts, and that doesn't, I wouldn't have done it that way. It's not bad. It's not bad. It's certainly not, I would never say it was bad. I just would have taken it in a different direction. And then he says Farrell's performance is excellent as Penguin. I agree that Colin Farrell's performance as Penguin is awesome. In fact, it's almost impossible to tell that it's Colin Farrell. There's only moments where you can kind of hear a Colin Farrell-esque voice there. So, I have some agreements and disagreements there, but, nothing too big. So I'm going to fast forward ahead to the 3-minute mark, and we'll see what Ben Shapiro has to say here. It's about this next segment.
And herein lies the main problem with the film.
The
biggest problem with the film is that the film hates Batman.
The film hates Batman.
$99 drone over established drone brands.
We have to get
There's a tiny US drone.
Apologies. The film hates Batman.
Like the actual Batman character hates the Batman character. And this drives me up an absolute wall. The biggest problem with the film is not the wokeness. Yes, there's some.
Okay, so he says that, and then he gets into some other things before he addresses that big problem. So let's get into some of the other things that he addresses first in the next portion of this. So he says that there's a mischaracterization of the Batman, and then he brings up there's some wokeness, which is not a major complaint of his, but he brings up the wokeness. So let me just explain some of those things that he says are woke elements, and we'll break those down a little bit. He mentions, and I want to be fair to Ben, because I don't want to ever miscategorize anybody. He's not super annoyed by the wokeness. He brings it up. He discusses it a little bit. That's not his main complaint. So we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but what he says is woke is basically that the characters of the characters that are portrayed by people of color are all portrayed as good characters. That's Catwoman, Gordon, and the new mayor. And then he says that the white characters are all portrayed as bad characters. And again, I want to give him credit. He's not saying that this is a major issue. He's just saying that it's something that appears in the film. Now, I have a slightly different take on this. So I disagree with him here. And here's why I disagree with this particular categorization, is that the setup of this film is that Gotham is insanely corrupt. And that's from government officials at the top all the way to just your street level criminals. And that's not uncommon for Gotham. That's incredibly common for Gotham. So the existing political infrastructure is corrupt, and that happens to be predominantly white, at least in this version of Gotham. Gordon and the mayoral candidate, who I can't remember her name, but she's a mayoral candidate who's running up against the mayor who is killed in the beginning of this film. They are definitely cleaner characters, right? They don't have as many associated weaknesses or things that they're involved in that are inherently corrupt. But I would also argue that those characters are barely important to this overall story. The mayoral candidate in general just serves as an alternative to the corruption that has existed prior in the city, and someone who's trying to overcome that by having a president or a mayoral campaign. So I don't think you can necessarily say she's good. I just don't think we know enough about her to say like, oh, she's really good. She does seem better than what exists, but what exists is being shown to us as corrupt and criminal and having major issues all the way down with this existing political infrastructure. So sure, you could say that she seems good, but I mean, she's such a minor character that any minor character can kind of seem good. Now, I think that Catwoman is interesting, but I don't think we could ever call Catwoman good. I think Catwoman is the person we see Gotham through her eyes, and we see like, well, this is clearly bad, and this is clearly bad. But don't forget, Catwoman is willing to do things that are also contributing to Gotham's problems. I mean, she's robbing from people. She, at several points of the film, is willing to kill people. So, I don't think that you can call her good. You can maybe call her like chaotic good, where she's doing some things that are maybe not things that we would think you should do, but she's doing them for good reasons. You could say that. But again, I think the portrayal of Catwoman is, first of all, it's very comics accurate in my opinion. Obviously, whenever we talk about Batman comics, saying something's comics accurate is like, well, which comics are you talking about? Because there's a plethora of comics to choose from. But I do think that in general, her portrayal of Catwoman is fantastic. To me, the setup here is more about existing political and societal infrastructure, and that being the status quo, versus new thinking and ways of changing what Gotham should be, right? So it's not necessarily about wokeism versus maybe what you'd call like conservatism or something along those lines. I think it's really more about existing infrastructures and existing systems versus new thinking that is rebelling against this corrupt part of the system. So the legacy political societal landscape is slightly older and white, but to me, given Gotham's history, that's not necessarily surprising. Like, that's not something that I would look at and be like, oh, well, clearly this is more woke than every other Batman comic, right? Like, it seems like a lot of the Batman comics that infrastructure exists in that way. And I think too, if you talk about both Batman and the Riddler, two white characters, they're trying to help topple Gotham's corruption. So it's not just, people who are a little bit more woke who are trying to topple this existing corruption. You also have people who are also shown as white characters who are fighting the white infrastructure. So I just don't know if that argument holds a lot of weight for me personally. And again, I got to give credit where credit is due. He's not complaining a lot about this. He's just saying that this exists. And by the way, I think you can even argue that, Gordon isn't 100% good either. So one of the things he was saying was the mayoral candidate, Gordon, and Catwoman are shown to be the good characters. But I mean, even Gordon is enlisting the help of a vigilante in Batman, like, right? Like, so if you're a person who's like, they would lean, let's call it woke, right? They would be saying like, we should defund the police. Well, you're definitely anti-Batman. Like, the last thing you want someone running around the streets, a white guy in a costume running around the streets doing whatever he wants to, especially with weaponry and so forth. And even when you look at the street level criminals, I mean, some of the street level criminals we see are white, but some of those street level criminals we see are people of color. So I don't know. I mean, I know that there are phrases in the movie that are used that I think, Catwoman has a phrase in this film that, old white guys with privilege or something along those lines. But that's like a line that someone would say. Like, so that's like kind of reflecting some of what reality is in our current environment. So now I will say this. If we were to go on and see in a sequel film, which I'm sure we're going to get because this film has been doing really well, if we were going to go on and see a sequel film and they delved into the new mayor's background a little bit more, and she was completely uncorrupt and had no weaknesses and had no she was just a completely clean, everything works out great character, then I think that you might have more of an argument to be made there, is that that maybe we're getting along the lines of not being able to showcase things quite fairly, because every character should have weaknesses and every character should be tempted to do wrong, and no character is going to act in ways that are I mean, maybe Superman because he's the ultimate Boy Scout, but very, very few characters, I should say, are going to be not tempted to be doing something that's incorrect there. So, and again, to be fair to Ben, he's not really like super upset about this specific point, but I would say, like, I'm not sure that I see the same amount of wokeness that he sees, and I do have a pretty sensitive woke meter. Let's see what he has to say coming up here in the next part of this.
Up like a bat and go around beating up criminals. It's not answered, and the director doesn't know, and the writer doesn't know.
So let me go back.
Always for film lefty Twitter, but the main theme is not a throwaway. The main theme is what matters here. The film despises Batman. So every Batman iteration has to explain why a man who is a billionaire would dress up like a bat and go around beating up criminals. It's not answered, and the director doesn't know, and the writer doesn't know, and this is the problem. So in the Nolan,
so interesting, and he's going to go into describing the Nolan's universe, and I'll describe that here a little bit as well. But this is a really interesting point, because basically what he's saying is, why is Batman, aka Bruce Wayne, why is he doing what he's doing? So let's break down a little bit of his argument here. One, he's using Nolan's movies as a comparison, and also notes that Nolan's movies are the best Batman movies. I'm going to partially agree with that, but I'll talk about that in a bit. He does point out that that Nolan's Batman had to become Batman to fight crime and cause criminals to fear him, because no amount of money could be used to fight crime. So he had to actually fight back against crime by causing criminals to fear the symbol of Batman. And I would say that's a pretty good assessment. So yeah, excellent assessment, Ben. That is exactly what is happening in The Dark Knight, or the Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. What Batman is doing is he's saying, I need to become a symbol of justice. And in order to become a symbol of justice, I can't do what my dad did, what Thomas Wayne did, and infuse money into that system, because criminals don't fear the money. Oftentimes they'll just use the money. They'll somehow get access to that money and use it to their own ends. So it's not preventing the heinous crimes that are happening. Okay, so what am I going to do? Well, I have to make the criminals fear me. I have to make the criminals fear to do the thing that we don't want them to do in Gotham. And so therefore I'm going to become Batman. So I think that's a good assessment. I think Ben's take there is really strong. Now, he says that there is no reason, though, as to why Pattinson, this Matt Reeves, Robert Pattinson Batman, is doing what he's doing. I'm going to keep saying Pattinson, by the way, just so we can delineate between the Nolan Batman and the Reeves Batman. So why is Pattinson doing what he's doing? So here's my response to this line of thinking from Ben Shapiro. While I agree that Nolan's first two films, Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, are superior to the Batman, I do think that the Batman is maybe a little bit better, if not a lot better in some people's eyes, especially, and in my own eyes, I think I would say that it's better than the third film, The Dark Knight Rises. That film actually, I think, has some of the same issues that this film does, honestly, in some ways. There's some comparisons to be made there. But Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, I do think, are the best Batman films. He calls them the best superhero films. I don't know that they're the best superhero films, but they're certainly near the top. I like Guardians of the Galaxy a lot. Really love Man of Steel too. That's up there. The Wonder Woman film, that's up there for me. And I like Zack Snyder, right? So a lot of people do not like Zack Snyder. They hate it when I say that, but I really like Zack Snyder. So a lot of his films I am a big fan of. So I think he's like, he's on to something there, but he's not exactly on the same page as I am. Now, let's break down Batman's why in the Batman, because he's saying that there is no why, that the writers don't know what Batman's why is, and nor does the director. And I actually disagree with that. And here's why. Thomas Wayne in the Batman started the renewal project, but that renewal project has not worked. The renewal project was an influx of funds because Thomas Wayne is a billionaire, an influx of funds into Gotham to try and solve some of Gotham's problems. But clearly Gotham still has massive problems. So the renewal project has not worked at all. And so the question is, why has it not worked? And that is what both the Riddler and the Batman are attempting to solve in this film. So like in the Nolan universe, money doesn't solve Gotham's problems. There's no amount of money that's going to solve the problems that exist in Gotham City. So I agree with Ben's take that Bale's Batman needs to create a symbol of justice. I disagree with his take, though, that Pattinson, Robert Pattinson's Batman, doesn't have a why. So here's my thinking about how that works. Since the renewal project did not work, Thomas Wayne's legacy did not work. In fact, some of his legacy is even called into question in this film as to whether he did things out of a corrupt kind of perspective, or whether he did them out of a justice sort of perspective. And different people have different. Falcone has one feeling about that, and Alfred has a different feeling about that. By the way, special call out to Andy Serkis. Not necessarily my favorite Alfred. However, this dude has been in Marvel. This dude has been in DC. This dude has been in King Kong. This dude has been in Star Wars. He played Snoke in Star Wars. And he was in Lord of the Rings. Andy Serkis is like a geek hero at this point, right? Like, certainly is an awesome character. So thank you, Andy Serkis, for being involved in all of our favorite properties here. So not only did Thomas Wayne's legacy not work in Gotham, but in fact, Thomas Wayne was murdered in Gotham. He got caught up in the crime that he was trying to prevent and or solve. So Pattinson's Batman is doing what he's doing because very few people in Gotham actually understand the issues that the city faces. And when you don't understand a problem, it's impossible to really solve it the right way. When you don't understand what the root of the problem is, you will do things that Catwoman is doing. Now, we can look at Catwoman and say, yeah, Catwoman is doing some things that I would have done. She's stealing from the corrupt people. She's trying to fight for the little guy. However, in doing those things, she's perpetuating the system of corruption that she's involved in, right? And so what I would categorize that as is that Catwoman doesn't understand the real problem and is thus trying to solve some of the other problems that exist in her own way, as opposed to solving the root of the problem. So I think that Batman in this film thinks that by becoming a detective, the world's greatest detective, as we know in the comics, he can effectively figure out what's making Gotham so corrupt and then solve the problem that way. So it's not the same. He has not yet created the full Bale Batman excuse yet. He hasn't fully lived into, I need to create the symbol so that I can. Now he acknowledges that he's already become a symbol, because whenever the bat symbol is displayed, people do fear him. They show that, but he's still thinking that he might need to be vengeance. He just doesn't know what the problem is yet. And so he's, I think that's really, when it comes down to it, though, him becoming a better detective is his why, so that he can figure out how to solve Gotham's problems. It just so happens that by being that detective, he has to be really aggressive, because he's going to be dealing with the dozens of Gotham's underworld. And so I do think that the director and the writer understands Pattinson's motivation, and I do believe they understand his why. So Ben says that's never explained, but I would argue that it's actually heavily implied, and so I would disagree with him there. Batman's why is discovering, by becoming the world's greatest detective, why Gotham has so many problems and what is the core of that problem. And now, why is that important to him? Because his parents were killed by Gotham's violence, and so therefore he wants to solve Gotham's violence. And that does set up the vengeance take that Pattinson will ultimately fail at, because it's not the correct way to solve this particular problem, right? I also will say that that Ben Shapiro in this review goes on to say that Batman and Bruce Wayne are essentially the same character. And I agree that it doesn't feel quite like the right Batman, or the Batman that we expect to see. Again, in the comics, there are many different versions of Batman. And it does not also feel like the right Bruce Wayne. But I also think that this is a much younger Batman. He's got things to learn. This is not somebody who shows up with, I'm Batman. I've been doing this for 10 years. I know what the game is. I know how to play the game. This is a Batman that's very early on in his career. So this is okay. I don't think he knows how to use the Bruce Wayne character versus how to use the Batman character yet. He hasn't even come up with a definition of that because he still doesn't know why Gotham's problems are so bad. This is what this movie is trying to expose. So I think that Pattinson's Batman actually feels like Nolan's Bruce Wayne before he became Batman. This is when he was going to go, when he had the gun on him and he was going to go shoot one of the people in the trial. He feels like that kind of character. He's just a little bit further along because he's already become Batman. And he kind of wants revenge. He wants vengeance. This is part of what he says he's all about. So I have no problem with that. I actually disagree with his points there. Now let's skip ahead to a little further in the video and see what Ben's next take is. We're going to go about to 750 here. We'll play it from right here.
A lot. That's pretty much all he does. He's a bad detective. He doesn't do anything. The plot is that all these people get killed. Batman uncovers it. He realizes that his dad was corrupt also, or that his dad engaged in corruption with Carmine Falcone. Finally, we get to the end. Paul Dano does it's such a ripoff of Seven. He gives himself up.
You're going to get another ad here. This podcast is not sponsored by pizza, but if you feel like having a pizza, do it.
Batman does not prevent a single one of these deaths. Batman, in fact, is complicit in one of the deaths by accident. And he doesn't actually capture the Riddler because he's clever. The Riddler gives himself up by sitting at a diner and getting arrested.
This is interesting. Okay, so this is interesting. This is an interesting Ben take, which we're going to dive a little bit deeper into. And this is where he's saying that the Batman doesn't actually solve any problems or prevent any crime that the Riddler is perpetrating. You could argue that he does help prevent some of the chaos at the very end of the film that Riddler's followers are trying to perpetrate. But other than that, yeah, I mean, he's not wrong here. Batman is failing a lot on his way to solving the end problem. So Riddler is succeeding in most everything, and Riddler's perspective that Batman is on his team is a very interesting one. And this is where, so I agree that this whole portion of the movie is a little bit awkward, but I also enjoy the fact that Batman is failing, because failure is what often teaches us to learn, especially heroes, right? Hero's journey is all about how do you keep failing while you move ahead into what you are going to become eventually. And so interesting takes there. And I think that he's basically right on. Batman's not solving any of those things. And that is awkward because we feel like Batman should be the greatest detective already. And we know that in this movie, he's not necessarily. He's working up towards that. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because this is where we really get into, this is the last segment I'm going to play of his review. Oh, actually, I got one more to play for his review. But we're getting into the root of the problem that Ben has with this film. So I'm going to skip ahead to 842 about, and we'll play that for a little bit. Here we go.
From City. And so Batman goes up there and he's beating people up. There comes a point where he's beating this guy and he's really like maybe beating him almost to death. And he stops and they take off that guy's mask and they say, "Who are you?" And the guy says, "I am vengeance." Okay, now this is the theme throughout the film. Ooh, the theme. Okay, so in order to explain why this is a problem, you have to now understand the character of the Riddler. So it says right at the beginning of the movie, "Who is Batman? I'm vengeance," right? He's just on the streets and he's beating people up.
I'm vengeance.
And then people keep calling him Mr. Vengeance for no apparent reason. Like we don't know why they're calling him that because he never actually publicly says he's vengeance. It's in his creepy diary, which again is supposed to be a mirror image of the fact that the Riddler also keeps a Zodiac killer style diary. So they're supposed to be two halves of the same whole. Batman is beating up this follower of the Riddler's. He takes off his mask and the guy says, "I'm vengeance." And suddenly Batman realizes he can't be vengeance. That's not what he's meant to do. He's betrayed his mission. And so
interesting points here. Interesting points from Mr. Shapiro here. So let's just cover this again. What's Ben Shapiro's take here? Then we're going to play this clip a little bit longer and watch a little bit more of it. Everyone sees Batman as vengeance, and Batman claims to be vengeance. But then when Batman hears that the Riddler's followers are also claiming to be vengeance, right? He just explained that in that scene. We saw a little bit of the clip from it too. That Batman has this epiphany that like vengeance is wrong, right? Like that's the kind of the crux of this part of the story. Batman started out thinking vengeance was the right way to behave. As he's done his detective work, what he's realizing is that the problem in Gotham is not the same as what he thought it was, and therefore vengeance as a solution is probably not going to work. Now, I actually agree with Ben's assessment here that this is interesting. I think he's onto something, But also, I don't have any problems with Batman learning that vengeance is bad or wrong, because vengeance is very bad and very wrong, right? Like, that should be apparent. Like, one of the things in Batman is, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but one of the philosophies in Batman is that if Batman were to act out of vengeance because his parents were killed, out of his own trauma, is he has personal trauma, and then he puts that personal trauma back into the world in the form of vengeance. That is not justice. That is not heroic behavior. Other characters might do some of those kinds of things, but that is not actually what Batman does. Batman actually says, I had trauma. I want to prevent that trauma from happening to other people in Gotham, and therefore I'm going to become justice for Gotham. Notice the difference there. It's not a selfish act. It's a selfless act, right? He has to say, well, this happened to me. Now I need to get over it in order to help other people. So I think it's good that this message is embedded in the Batman, whereas Ben maybe thinks it's not good. But what we're going to now get into is something that I probably am far more in agreement with Ben Shapiro on than maybe some other people. So let's go ahead and play through about minute 10, a little after minute 10, and then we'll see what Ben's take is here.
He then descends on an electrified cable because he's trying to stop people from being electrocuted by this flying electrical wire. And he cuts off the cable. He's holding on to it. He falls down into the water. A rebaptism. He gets up, and then he proceeds to lead a bunch of people who are not really trapped, but kind of trapped, I suppose. And he leads them to, I guess, a safer place by carrying a torch. And then he goes up to the top of Madison Square Garden, and he is helping people be airlifted and evac'd out, medevac'd out. And this is how he has learned fulfillment.
Gotham Square Garden, by the way, not Madison Square Garden. Although I can understand why he would say that, because it looks just like Madison Square Garden in a lot of ways. All right, so let's get into this, because now we're getting into, and I'm not going to play any other clips from Ben's video. Again, you should go watch Ben's video if you really want to see all of the nuances of his take. I'm trying to describe them here, and shout out to him for putting this video out there. But you know, I'm not going to show any more of it. You can go watch the rest of it and see what his full take is. I'll talk about some of it here, though. So Ben's take ultimately about what this movie is about and why he doesn't like it, why he actually hates it. We both saw him say that. We all saw him say that in the beginning of this clip, or heard him say it. This movie is about how fighting criminality or criminals isn't doing any good. And then Ben says, well, he has to stop being Batman because he can't fight criminals and actually has to become more like Superman. And he needs to save people as opposed to beating up bad guys. That's the character change that we see here. And he calls that a defund the police attitude. Ben calls it that. Ben calls it in his video a defund the police attitude. So Batman is supposed to be someone who protects innocents and targets criminals. And so Ben thinks that Matt Reeves hates Batman, and thus Ben hates the Batman. And that's basically his overall take. So do I agree with this aspect of Ben's take? I've agreed with some of the things he said. I've disagreed with some of the other things that he said. Well, the first thing I'll disagree with is I don't think this is about a defund the police attitude. I don't think that that's right. I talked about this earlier. A defund the police attitude would assume that no vigilante could ever exist, because you don't, I mean, I shouldn't say that. There's some people that would say communities should police themselves, but honestly, I don't think that that's about the police force. I think it's about the type of police force that exists, right? So that's different. But a vigilante who's just puts on a costume and has a lot of heavy weaponry and goes out into the populace to fight crime, I don't think that is a defund the police. I don't think that's one of their principles. Like, let's go fund vigilantes. I don't think that that's part of their thing. I do, though, totally agree with Ben Shapiro. I totally agree with him in terms of the characterization of Batman in the last few minutes of this film. Not really feeling like Batman to me. Now, have I already acknowledged and already agreed that he needs to learn that vengeance is not the right thing to do? Yes, I have acknowledged that. I agree with that. I think that Matt Reeves pointing that out is really important. I think that Matt Reeves pointing that out in 2022, where a lot of people want to take vengeance into their own hands on airplanes and stuff, it's a good message, actually. It's a good message. It's something we should think about, right? Especially when you see corruption, and which we see a lot of these days. So I agree that that's a good message. However, when we see Batman, Ben mentioned him cutting the electrical wire, effectively saving some people because they're all in the water, and if the electrical cable fell in the water, they'd all be electrocuted. He cuts off the electrical wire. I kind of thought that he was going to have. By the way, when I was watching that scene unfold in the theater, I kind of thought that he was going to have like some lingering problem related to getting electrocuted, but of course he doesn't. It's just kind of not a big deal. And then he, like Ben said, he lights the torch, and then leads these people out from this water. A cool scene, by the way, cool looking scene. But so I don't have any problems with those things because that's Batman showcasing to the populace that he's not just somebody who beats up other people. He also is here to do good things, right? I don't have a problem with that. So when I talk about it not feeling like Batman, what am I talking about? Well, at the end of the movie, when he's talking about how there's a voiceover, which voiceovers are always difficult to pull off well. I'll put it that way. A lot of writers actually will try to avoid voiceovers at all costs because they have major issues with them. I don't necessarily have major issues with them. We used a voiceover in our film, in our Star Wars fan film that we did. We used a voiceover there. But I do have an issue where he's talking about, I need to become Hope. This is, in my opinion, I think not what Batman is attempting to become. Nolan was much closer to saying, I need to become fear for the people who are perpetrating evil so that they will stop perpetrating evil. Batman's not becoming fear in the Nolan universe so that he can oppress a populace. He's using fear to make people make the right decision. It's no different than the laws we have in place, right? The laws we have in place are partially there to create fear from you disobeying them, right? Like that's part of the reason why we have laws is that hopefully you won't go commit crimes because you're afraid of going to jail or having some bigger problem arise in your life here. So Ben calls this a fundamental betrayal of the character, and I think that that's partially true. I think that some of his logic here is actually sound. It's a partial betrayal of the character. Now, I'm talking about a much smaller piece of the film than Ben is. I'm talking about the voiceover where he says, I'm going to have to become Hope, which I think is a very odd thing for him to say. So let me just say this. I love this film. Quite frankly, I love this film all the way up until we see Riddler in jail. And then from that point on, I think the film becomes a little less clear in what it's attempting to do. I don't mind the fact that there's the vengeance thing that he needs to learn not to be vengeance. And when he sees other people saying that they're also going to be vengeance, it's a realization for a vigilante to say, oh, whoa, other people have heard me say I'm vengeance and look what they're doing. Right? That's not good. In fact, in one of the Nolan movies, I believe it was The Dark Knight, people are dressing up like Batman to go beat up other people. So a realization, vengeance is not the thing that we're trying to do here. I also love the fact that it's dark and gritty. I love the music. We've already covered that. Batman is bitter, angry, and vengeful, but we know that Batman can't stay that way. So I like that aspect of it. The Riddler, besides the fact that I would probably have showcased him differently in this film, he actually serves as a good enemy here because Batman needs to see what it looks like to go too far when you're fighting corruption. That's great. That's great. Perfect portrayal of what that looks like. But in the end, I think that Ben is correct when he says that the concept of Batman is that in dealing with depravity, the depravity that exists in Gotham, the corruption, the injustice, the issues in Gotham, the question of Batman is not how do we provide people hope, but rather how do we create order out of chaos? That's different. Those are two different things. Superman is how can I show people what hope looks like and what people should be doing to showcase hope in their lives. That's different because Batman's character is never portrayed as a type of Christ, let's say, you would never look at Batman that way, but you might look at Superman sometimes that way because it's inherent in the character. In fact, the creation of Superman was very similar to saying, what would it look like if the Messiah, the character who's supposed to create a just and fair and equal society, that, which, by the way, is a different version than Jesus Christ as Messiah. I'm talking about more of a Jewish perspective of Messiah here. Superman is kind of that. He is. And that meaning hope. And if he looks like hope, that makes a lot of sense. Batman is distinctly not that, because Batman is about what is it okay to do in going about creating order. So imagine that Batman is more closely related to the First Order in Star Wars. The First Order takes it too far. They oppress, they come down on, they restrict people's freedoms. Batman says, in this super corrupt environment, how far do I have to fight back to overcome corruption? How far do I have to go to create a fear of doing evil so that we can create more order, so that the normal citizens who are doing the right things are not oppressed by the corrupt society? And the question of Batman is, when do you take order too far? And it's that tension of like freedom and like whether or not we should use violence and when we should use violence and what that looks like. Saying I'm going to become hope is, to me, I agree with Ben Shapiro, not what we actually expect out of Batman. Now, let's move on. Let's move on from this a little bit to say Batman is dealing with psychopaths a lot of times. What is Superman dealing with? Well, a lot of times he's dealing with existential threats or threats that are coming from a cosmic place, or threats that are coming because someone like Lex Luthor is abusing the capitalist system. And in his abuse of the capitalist system, Superman's like, well, we got to create hope here because this is not the American way, right? Truth and justice is the American way for Superman. So I think that Ben Shapiro's onto something, but I have less of a problem with overarchingly what he's saying is going on here. I don't think it's as serious as he's saying it's going on, but I do think it's worthy of actually exploring in more detail. So, partially agree with Ben Shapiro, partially disagree with him. He hates the film, and I think it's great up until the last 30 to 45 minutes. He said it was 1 million minutes long. That's pretty funny. I think I actually want to give him a credit for being pretty funny in that clip. I do, though. I'm not going to say it's a 10 out of 10. I think it's about a 6.5 out of 10. That's where I would probably put it on my scale. So he's partially right. I partially agree with him, but overarchingly, I don't agree with him fully. So there you go. That's my take on Ben Shapiro's take on the Batman. Let me know what your takes are in the comments down below. In the meantime, I am going to move on to the next segment where we talk about episode 4 of Moon Knight. And I will say this off the bat. This was my second favorite episode of Moon Knight. The first one was my favorite. This is my second favorite episode of Moon Knight. So let's get into why that is and what exactly is going on in the show. We'll dig a little deeper into it, look at some of the storytelling aspects that they're doing here. So one thing that did annoy me a little bit from last night's episode, episode 4, why didn't the Ennead, the Forum of Egyptian Gods, why didn't they send someone to verify that Harrow wasn't up to something? Like, can we do our due diligence, Egyptian gods, before we execute judgment? Basically, they basically, Khonshu gets a meeting with the Egyptian gods. He uses Mark Spector as his speaking piece because he speaks through him. He possesses him and speaks through him. All the other avatars are there for the other Egyptian gods. And the Egyptian gods are basically like, all right, well, you say that Arthur Harrow is bad. Let's ask Arthur Harrow. And Arthur Harrow, are you bad? I'm not bad. Khonshu's obviously bad. Yeah, you're right, Arthur Harrow. Khonshu's a jerk. All right, get him out of here. Right? Like they like literally lock Khonshu up in a statue without doing any due diligence. Like, can you go see what Arthur Harrow is doing? Like, that made me laugh. That made me laugh a little bit. I'm a big fan of this show, but I thought that if the Egyptian gods are only as sophisticated as your average Twitter user when it comes to due diligence, that may be something you want to take a look at. You may want to question that, call it into question. One question, by the way, I don't think we have an answer for yet is what will actually happen if Amit is released? It's interesting that they have not revealed that to us. We have a sense that it's bad, but we don't actually know what it is that will happen if Amit is released. And I think it's kind of interesting that they haven't gotten into that yet. But I will say this, I really loved this episode. I really, really love it. And for those of you who know me and know that I love Indiana Jones, you pretty much know why I love this episode. This felt like this is the closest thing since, since basically in terms of live action, this is the thing that has felt most like Indiana Jones to me, going all the way back to The Last Crusade. Now, I'm sure there's other things that have felt like Indiana Jones, and you can let me know in the comments, like, what are some of the other things that have felt like Indiana Jones to you? This really felt like Indiana Jones, and I really enjoyed the heck out of that. I did find some of the moments between Steven and Layla, I found them to be really well done, right? There's a pretty cute interactions between Steven and Layla. Layla kind of is attracted to Steven because he's basically Mark, but some things about Mark that she struggled with are not present in Steven. And then Steven, of course, is very fond of this woman who also shares his love of Egyptian things, but and he thinks she's beautiful, obviously. So I think that those are really cute scenes. But man, they were driving me nuts because I'm like, they're about to find Amit, dude. They're about to find Amit. You guys are making out and like having cute little scenes together. Like maybe save that for later. So it made me laugh a lot, but I didn't hate it because the scenes were really well done. So I liked it, but as a writer, I was thinking to myself, like, they're gonna find Amit before you get down there because you're kissing. We got this really interesting reveal that Alexander the Great was Amit's last avatar, or at least, yeah, I guess last avatar. I guess Arthur Harrow, I'm not sure is exactly her avatar yet, probably. So that's kind of an interesting take there. Is that but Alexander the Great being her last avatar is interesting. Would we say that Alexander the Great was evil? Well, he was certainly a conqueror and conquered a lot of territory and killed a lot of armies in the process. Now, did he oppress people along the way? We'd have to go deeper into an understanding of who Alexander the Great was and what he was up to. So I don't know the answer to that. But it is fascinating because he was Greek, or as they say in the show, Macedonian, but still considered himself a pharaoh. I had not heard that before, and I'm not an Egyptologist, so I had to go back and look into that to see how true that was. But that was really interesting. I really liked that because I was expecting to see some sort of other Egyptian lore worked in there, but it wasn't Egyptian lore at all. It was actually Macedonian, and that was fascinating to me. So that was fun. I think it's interesting to see if they're also suggesting that Amit was the conqueror and Alexander the Great, being her avatar, was just using her powers to do that. And that's what basically Arthur Harrow is looking for. That's interesting. That's an interesting thing to kind of explain what could happen if Amit was released. As I mentioned at the beginning of what I was talking about here, we don't really know what's going to happen when Amit's released. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe Arthur Harrow becomes the next Alexander the Great and just starts conquering territories, right? That could be part of it. Now, last episode, I did predict, last episode of this show, of the Story Geeks Show, I did predict, I shouldn't say last episode, on Thursday's episode, last Thursday's episode, I did predict that Mark was involved in Layla's father's death. I didn't get that 100% wrong, but it did turn out that was true, that he was involved in that. And we don't know exactly how Khonshu entered the picture here yet. We do know that Mark was a mercenary who was involved in a mercenary takeover of whatever archaeological dig Layla's father was overseeing, and that Mark got caught up in all that. Layla's father was killed in that. Mark was then shot by the same group of mercenaries. So presumably because there was some sort of treasure that they were taking, although we don't even know what that was. And then presumably this is when Khonshu showed up to say, hey, Mark, if you want to live, you can be my avatar, right? Like that's probably how that unfolded. We don't get that exactly, but that seems like we can infer that to a degree. Now, if you've seen the Thor trailer, which is a fun trailer for sure, Taika Waititi, it's going to be a fun trailer. It's not surprising. But you know that we've got Egyptian gods, we've got Norse gods. Thor's a Norse god. Odin was a Norse god. Loki's a Norse god. And then we've got Greek gods now too, because they have what many people are thinking. In my reaction to that, I was like, is this supposed to be Zeus? Because it seems like it's Zeus. Well, other people are saying like, yeah, we think it's Zeus. So you got Greek gods, you got Norse gods, you got Egyptian gods, all in the MCU. So that's pretty fascinating. It goes back to my conversation with Daryl and how we talked about how that changes the power dynamics in the MCU and who has what powers and why. So those are fascinating. It is pretty interesting to suggest that the entire time the MCU has been going on, there have been Egyptian gods playing in these things in some way, shape, or form, which is really interesting. There's one point in the show that I really liked, and that's when we can get a little bit deeper into this. When Arthur Harrow is asking Layla if Mark has told her the truth, her response is, well, obviously you're dying too. And I really like that because a lot of times as writers, we realize that we need to communicate something. We need to reveal something. There's a part in Death of a Bounty Hunter here, my novel, which is coming out as a full cast audiobook soon. And there's a part in there where one character needs to tell another character that something happened. And that always feels or can feel as if it's forced exposition, because that doesn't happen. You don't see that happen a lot of times in our daily lives, where it's like, why don't you just tell me what you obviously want to tell me something? Usually people just blurt it out, right? But writers, they don't blurt things out because they're working towards a climax, or they're working towards a twist, or they're working towards an angle. And so I like the fact that she said, well, you're obviously dying to tell me what happened, because it was almost like calling out that that's a weird thing that writers do. And I like that. I thought that was cool. I also thought that one of the phrases that Arthur Harrow gave us was really interesting, because if you'll notice, he said after he shoots Mark, he says to Mark, I can't save anyone who won't save themselves. I can't save anyone who won't save themselves. And I thought that was fascinating, because that goes really far back into a Western ideal. It is oftentimes conflated with a biblical ideal. Let's talk about that, because that's weird, right? This I can't save anyone who won't save themselves is very American meritocracy oriented. If you think about it, you deserve to be saved, then you can be saved, right? That's like the nature of that. If I can't save anyone who won't save themselves, so you got to be worthy of being saved, and then I'll save you. And which is kind of paradoxical in some ways. And this comes from it. This is just partially derived from an old American statement that was especially true of Christians, saying God helps those who help themselves. Very similar phrase. I can't save anyone who won't save themselves. God helps those who help themselves. And that phrase does not appear in the Bible, by the way. That's not actually something that God has ever said. People say God helps those who help themselves. Like it's not a thing. So that phrase, apparently, based on some very minor research I didn't do a whole bunch of research on that because I had to watch the show yesterday. But that phrase apparently comes from an ancient Greek phrase about the gods helping those who help themselves. So think about it this way. That phrase arose from a partial truth that we need to do things in order to what we sow, we reap, right? We need to do things in order to get things. That's the way the economy of the world works that way. But what's interesting to me is that it's not a biblical phrase at all. And I don't know how the Christians in America got a hold of it to say, God helps those who help themselves, because it's actually a misinterpretation. It's an anti-Christian phrase. Let me just put it that way. It is not a fundamental understanding. I'm going to get back to Arthur Harrow in a minute, by the way, but this is just some etymology of where he's coming from. I think it's really interesting. It's not a Christian phrase at all, because the entire concept of the Christian faith, now you may not hear this very often, because again, some people start to interpret things based on their own understanding as opposed to actually delving into what the sacred texts actually say about Christianity. But the entire concept of the Christian faith is that God helps those who literally cannot help themselves. Right? There's nothing a human being can do based on an understanding of the Bible. You may disagree with this, but I'm just saying what's in the Bible, what the Bible is telling us, is that there's nothing that a human being can do to be made worthy of God's grace or love. So there's nothing a human being can do to be made worthy of God's grace or love. That's interesting, because it's not at all what that phrase would suggest. God helps those who help themselves, right? That is why That is why that Christ's death and resurrection are critical to Christ followers. Because if he doesn't die and resurrect, then we are on the hook for saving ourselves and becoming worthy to have a relationship with God. But what I would tell you as a Christ follower is, well, there's nothing we can do. That's why Christ needed to die. Well, otherwise Christ would not have needed to die and resurrect. Right? That doesn't make any sense, actually, conceptually. If you can do it yourself, why would Christ have needed to die for you? So let's circle back around to Arthur Harrow, because actually that perspective matters as it pertains to his character. And I love his use of the phrase, because what it's doing is it's showing us what his religion is, and probably by definition what Amit's religion is. He thinks that people can make themselves worthy, and that he, along with Amit, uses the scales, the tattoo he has of the scales. He uses that to weigh people to see whether or not they're worthy. And if they're not worthy, they die. If they are worthy, they get to benefit by being a part of heaven on earth, right? And the question is why is that evil? What does it mean to be worthy? How can you possibly be worthy if you are killing people so that you can bring about heaven? Is it okay to kill people? And now we're getting into the Batman question. But this is really fascinating from this character's perspective. He definitely feels like what he feels is the right thing to do, and he's pursuing that. So I think that I really like it, because for a villain to say that makes a lot of sense, because it instantly adds him as a villain in my eyes, because as a Christ follower, I don't believe that people can save themselves or make themselves worthy. And so playing with that idea, I think, is really interesting to me. It's really a fascinating thing to play with. Now, that's the last part of this episode that makes a lot of sense. But the next part is actually awesome, even though it gets bizarre. Like, some people may not have liked it. I liked it a lot. We went from Indiana Jones to 12 Monkeys. The last few scenes of this particular episode really felt like 12 Monkeys to me, and it felt really fun because of it. So I liked that kind of callback to this kind of environment where we wonder if, as the viewers, we're the ones who are crazy because we don't have any clue about what's going on, right? I like that a lot. That was really fun. And but first, before we get to that kind of crazy scene, which I'll describe in a minute, we actually see Mark sinking into a pool, which I thought was really well done visually. Because a lot of times when a character is like entering the afterlife or something, it looks really dumb. In this, I think the fact that he kept sinking into that bottomless pool, and then there's the light that's shown, and he kind of fell into the light, that was kind of cool. And for a while there, it's really funny that I was watching it thinking like, oh, this looks like the sunken place from Get Out. Looks like he's falling into the sunken place, as you see the character from Get Out falls into that kind of abyss as well. And what's funny about that is that I watched this by myself. I made notes. I wrote that down. It seems like the sunken place. And as we were watching, my wife turned to me on that scene, because I watched it again with her, and she turned to me on that scene and was like, "Oh, this feels like the sunken place." I'm like, "Yeah, it totally does," which is really fun. But in this new scene, well, first of all, we get a really fun scene where we get this old VHS movie called Tombbusters, which is really funny. And it looks like sort of an Indiana Jones inspired ripoff movie, and we see that Stephen Grant is the lead character in that movie, and that Mark Spector has made a hero out of Stephen Grant, this guy who's looking for Egyptian relics and things. Actually, in the movie, he's actually looking for Aztec relics, but same, that he's that kind of character. And so we're wondering, does that mean that Stephen Grant doesn't actually exist and he's a figment of Mark Spector's imagination, and that he's a different personality that he's drawn to because of that? Which I thought was really an interesting question. And then we see a bunch of people in the mental institution, including both familiar characters and familiar objects. We see an action figure of the Moon Knight. There's Egyptian artifacts. I couldn't remember why there was cupcakes. They kept showing cupcakes, and I'm like, where did the cupcakes come from? Did he buy cupcakes at some point in time in the first episode or something? I don't remember that. If you remember that, let me know. But there was a bunch of things that were called out. Whether it was the photo, there was the picture on Arthur Harrow is his psychiatrist. He's wearing sandals. He has a cane, things that Arthur Harrow had in real life, whatever that means, because we don't know. And then there was a picture on the wall of the European area where Arthur Harrow was building up his followers, where we actually first see Arthur Harrow, I believe. I believe that's the first time we ever see him. So again, all of that reminded me of 12 Monkeys. There's a ton of callbacks in there. I thought it was a great scene. And then we hit the end of the episode where Mark escapes from Arthur Harrow. He finds Stephen in a sarcophagus. He passes up another sarcophagus that is definitely inhabited by the third personality, who we have yet to meet. We only have a couple episodes yet. We have yet to meet the third character. I believe this is a six episode run. Correct me if I'm wrong. It could be 8, but I'm pretty sure it's 6. And then all of a sudden they open the door and they run into the hippo goddess. And that was extremely bizarre. She spoke English and she kind of waved at them comically. She was a CG character, obviously. And then they just freak out. So this episode felt a lot more similar to Loki to me in a lot of ways. You know, there's the episode where the two Lokis, the female Loki and the male Loki, well, the normal Loki, I should say, I guess it's the 2012 Loki, for the lack of a better description, the lead character in that show. When they get to I don't remember the name of them, but they're like the Time Council, right? Like if you're in the comments, let me know what the name of them was. But they get to the Time Council, and then they realize it's all fake. Like, oh wow, this whole setup is like fake. And that's sort of what feels like is happening here in Moon Knight, is that they are showing up somewhere and it feels like maybe this is fake. Like maybe they are trapped in some sort of mind prison where they're trying to work Mark Spector out of his, belief system. So maybe there's like a world where there's one Egyptian god who can alter reality for all of the avatars who die. But maybe we'll see more of this in the upcoming episode. I don't know. I don't know much about the Egyptian goddess who is showcased as a hippo. I don't know much about that. So I will say this episode was my second favorite episode. I really, really enjoyed it. And probably after the first episode, it was something that I really thought was great. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Now let's go behind the scenes of Chapter 1 of Death of a Bounty Hunter, the full cast audiobook. Let's get into how we produce the full cast audiobook of Death of a Bounty Hunter, because a full cast audiobook is not something that you see very often. So how did we do it? How did it come about? I'll talk a little bit about that. You've heard me read part of the first chapter myself. On Tuesday, I played a clip from the full cast audiobook version where Tim Lim and Benjamin James, two of the actors that we hired to play the two roles, they actually completed that scene. So that was really fun. And I think the question for today that I'll answer as a behind the scenes kind of question is, how do you go about writing a full cast audiobook? So for anybody out there who's like, wow, that's kind of a cool idea. It's not really an audio drama. If you listen to the clip, you would realize it's not really an audio drama, but it has some of the same feel in some ways. So what's different about a full cast audiobook? What's different about an audio drama? And how do you actually write something like that? That's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit now. Well, first of all, there were two inspirations for the full cast audiobook. The first inspiration came, if you have been to the How Stories Work with Jay Shear channel, there is a movie on that channel that the Reclamation Society, the nonprofit that Nathan and I operate, we produced a short film. Marianne Holland starred in that film alongside Maddie Curley. Was another star of that film. Benjamin James directed that film. Lucas Colombo was the DP. Fantastic! They did a fantastic job. Go check that out. It's a Star Wars fan film. It meant a lot to us to produce it. It is an anti-bullying Star Wars fan film, but in a very interesting way that you probably would not expect. So go check that out on that channel. We created that film in 2016, and that was a really fun process. But if you're going to do professional looking short films, it is going to cost you a lot of money. And so we raised a lot of money. A lot of the actors and the people on set took huge pay cuts to work on that film with us because they were all huge Star Wars fans and they believed in the script. They believed in the story. They wanted to create the film with us. Again, it's not a PSA for anti-bullying. It's a very pretty in-depth look at bullying and what it does to people. So they all really liked it, and I was really privileged to work with all of them, blessed to work with all of them. So we did that film, and we realized once that film was complete, how expensive it was to produce films like that. Really expensive. At the same time, we had started the Story Geeks podcast. We had started getting cool microphones like these. By the way, I usually buy these things used at like a Guitar Center or something. So if you ever want to buy like a setup, but you want to get it for cheaper, buy them used. But they're really quality. They're really high quality stuff. So we had started to get all of this audio equipment. We have these friends, a large network of friends who are actors or involved in Hollywood productions of all kinds of sorts. And so we said, we really want to do something that's like a film, but it's hard to afford to produce lots of films. So what we said was, what if we did an audiobook? I had listened to Neil Gaiman's American Gods. And Neil Gaiman's American Gods, really interesting book, by the way. Lots of mythology in terms of gods is included in Neil Gaiman's work, which is worth reading if you're having fun, like unraveling what Moon Knight is all about and what the MCU is doing with gods. American Gods is a really interesting take on mythology and gods and how those things work. But I listened to that full cast audiobook, and it was very apparent to me that book was written as a normal novel. And then later on, they decided that since we were producing the TV show, what if we had those same actors come in and voice the roles in the book and then release that as a full cast audiobook? And as I listened to that, I thought to myself, you know what? You can do a full cast audiobook in a way that's different than most full cast audiobooks are produced. Most full cast audiobooks there's a novel, the novel does well enough, and then they say we should produce a full cast audiobook of this novel. But if you were to start writing a full cast audiobook from the very beginning, knowing that it was going to be a full cast audiobook, how would that be different? In other words, it's not that it was something that was adapted to be a full cast audiobook, but was actually written to be a full cast audiobook. How would it be different? And so Nathan and I took that as a challenge, and we started writing Death of a Bounty Hunter as a full cast audiobook, even before we thought about it as a novel. So it had existed as a short film. It had existed as a short story, prose. But we said, before we make it a novel, let's actually make it a full cast audiobook first, and then take that script and adapt it into being a novel. And the reason we did that was because when I listened to Neil Gaiman's full cast audiobook of American Gods, it was basically one narrator reading like 90% of the book. And then there was other voices of other characters who said things in the story. But since a lot of that takes place as a third person narrator, there wasn't a lot of voice work to be done by the cast, nor was there changing narration styles depending on who was narrating, because there's only one person narrating the whole time as a third person narrator the whole time, the whole way through. So the first thing we changed about our book was it was going to be first person narration from 3 different character perspectives, meaning that we had 3 narrators that essentially narrate anywhere from 20 to 30% of the book. Or I should say probably 20 to 40% of the book. Each one of them is responsible for a big chunk of the book. And so Tim Lim plays Flint, Timothy Prindle plays Deckard, and Marianne Holland plays Audrey Matheson. And then for the other characters, so when we went into writing it, we knew it's going to be first person perspective of the characters, not a third person perspective where they're telling you what the character's thinking or telling you what the character's doing, but rather inhabiting the brain of a character. They're telling you how they're feeling. They're telling you how they're interacting with the world. That was how we wrote that book. 3 different characters narrating. Then we added more dialogue from other characters where possible. I'd love to even add a little bit more dialogue if I could in the next book we do, but so that we can get more actors involved and they could be doing more fun things. So that was really how we said, if we're going to adapt this and write a full cast audiobook to be a full cast audiobook, that's how we would adapt it. And that's what we did. Now you'll notice that it is not an audio drama. And I have a video I did about this too. Like, well, what's a full cast audiobook and what's an audio drama, and why is there a difference? And does anyone care? Well, you might not care, but I cared a lot because in a lot of audio dramas, there's a lot of reliance upon sound design to tell the story. That can be good, but I think it can also be negative because from a writing perspective, you have to do a little bit more telling as opposed to showing. Now, what's the difference between telling and showing? I could do an entire podcast on that, but basically, if I say I'm anxious, I'm telling you that I'm anxious. If I say I'm sweating, my palms are slick with sweat, my heartbeat's going faster, I am fidgeting in my chair, I haven't told you that I'm anxious, but I'm showing you that I'm anxious. Basically, that's the difference between telling and showing, right? Just one thing is I'm going to tell you directly. The other thing is I will showcase it to you in behaviors and in thought processes and in what I'm concerned about. So in an audio drama, a lot of times, because of the nature of it, a lot of times you don't have an internal monologue of any one character to tell you what's going on, and or a third person narrator especially is usually not present. And so what you have is you have characters that say things that people normally wouldn't say, like, sure is cold in here. Well, because how else would I know it was cold? Right? Like, there's no way for me to know it was cold unless a character says that. And now sometimes that's normal for a character to just say, but sometimes it's awkward for a character to say, like, why would you say that? It's like irrelevant to what's happening. So so there are some great audio dramas out there. There are some great audio drama writers out there, but I didn't think that that was probably something that I could do as well. And so what I tried to do instead was it's an audiobook style where we're in the character's mind. It's a first person perspective. So they are acting it out, but I can use, more of what I'm accustomed to in writing, both whether it's screenwriting and or novel writing. And the big difference, and one of the big things I think that makes novel writing more fun than screenwriting, because there's a lot of things that make screenwriting more fun than novel writing, but one of the things that makes novel writing more fun than screenwriting is you can actually inhabit a character's thoughts. Can you do that with a screenplay? Yeah, but it's going to be a voiceover. And we just talked about Batman and how, basically the end voiceover for Batman is what ruined it. Not ruined it, what made it less impactful to me. And so in an audio book or a novel, you can get into the character's mind much easier than you can in a film, because a lot of times in a film, it doesn't work as well. You can do it, doesn't work as well. Some people have done it very creatively and it's worked great. It's harder to pull it off. So that's how we went into how do you write a full cast audiobook. I'm not even sure if that's something that I'm sure someone has done it before, but like most of the time it's you write a novel and they convert it to a full cast audiobook. We literally went, let's do it differently. Let's start out writing a full cast audiobook. So there you go. There's a little bit behind the scenes about how that came about and why that came about. I'll go even deeper behind the scenes. I'll play a little bit more from the full cast audiobook. The official release date of the full cast audiobook is now available. The full cast audiobook, the official release date is May 2nd. We're only a few weeks away from the full cast audiobook being out. I have already signed up for our distributor. It is in their hands. They have already approved the audio. All that's left is for May 2nd to come around and you can literally pick up a copy of the audiobook, which is insanely exciting. And I would really like to have I really want to have a release party for that. So if you want an invitation to that release party, just reach out to me, contact me through one of our social accounts, or shoot me an email or something and say, hey, I'd really like to come to that release party for your full cast audiobook. What I'm hoping we can do is maybe have some of the actors act out some of the roles and act out some of the scenes. That would be really, really fun. So anyways, that is it for today's show. Don't forget, new episodes of the Story Geeks Show come out every Tuesday and every Thursday. On Tuesday, April 26th, we will be talking about Tokyo Vice yet again. I don't have a guest lined up for that yet, so it might be a solo show, but we'll see. We'll see how that turns out. We will be talking about Tokyo Vice Episode 4 and maybe even Tokyo Vice Episode 5. We'll see if I can get 2 shows in. I also have to watch another movie because on next Thursday, if you guys have listened to the show, then you remember Mike Biondo. He's the one that's watching Star Wars for the first time. Well, Mike Biondo's favorite movie is The Blues Brothers, and he wants to watch that with me and talk about it on this podcast. So he'll be on next Thursday's show. We'll be talking about The Blues Brothers and probably a little bit more about Moon Knight as well. Subscribe to the Story Geeks Show on YouTube or on your preferred podcast provider so you don't miss an episode. All episodes are published to the podcast feed right after I finish recording them on YouTube. So if this is a show that you're like, hey, an hour and 15 minutes, an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half sometimes, that's too long for me. I'd rather just listen on my way to work. You can listen on a podcast feed. In fact, your drive home to work today could be on the podcast feed, listening to me talk about all of this nonsense. It's all great stuff, and I love talking about it. So hopefully you love it too. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of The Batman or episode 4 of Moon Knight, and I will see you next Tuesday. Have a fantastic weekend.